8 guests Johnny Carson hated so much they were banned for life. The king of late night had a memory like steel and a temper that rarely showed itself on camera. But when it did, careers ended overnight. For 30 years, Johnny Carson reigned over American television with that charming grin, razor-sharp timing, and a Midwestern politeness that made millions believe he was everyone's friend. But behind that desk, behind that smile, lived a man who ran his kingdom with quiet ruthlessness. Carson didn't shout. He didn't confront. He simply erased people. A former Tonight Show booker once said, "Johnny Carson didn't argue. He vanished you." Tonight, we're revealing the 8 guests whose behavior, betrayal, arrogance, or outright chaos infuriated Carson so deeply that he closed the door on them permanently. And while some names on this list were explosive disasters the moment they stepped on Carson's stage, others had no idea they had crossed the most powerful man in television until they discovered they would never sit on that couch again. Some bans lasted years, some lasted decades, and a few were never lifted, not even after Carson's death. And it all begins with the guest whose betrayal cut Carson so deeply that he never recovered from it. 1. Joan Rivers, the protégé who broke Carson's heart. Joan Rivers wasn't just a Tonight Show regular. She was the heir apparent. Carson personally championed her at a time when female comedians were dismissed, mocked, and pushed aside. He invited her to dinners, coached her writing, encouraged her bravery, and on live television told the world, "You're going to be a big star." Coming from Carson, that wasn't a compliment. It was a prophecy, which is why her betrayal remains one of the most famous in television history. When Fox secretly offered Rivers her own competing late-night show, she accepted, but hesitated to tell Carson. Not out of malice, but fear. She knew what it meant. She kept delaying the call. She waited one day too long. Carson woke up to the headline in Variety. Not a phone call. Not a warning. A headline. He stared at it, went silent, and walked into his office, a staffer revealed. He didn't yell. He didn't swear. He just said, "She didn't even call me." That was the last time Rivers' name was spoken in Carson's presence. He cut her off completely, personally and professionally. Her Tonight Show history erased. Her calls unanswered. Her attempts at apology returned unopened. To Carson, the betrayal was unforgivable because it came from someone he treated like family. The ban lasted 22 years, until after Carson died. 2. Wayne Newton, the guest who threatened Carson. Backstage, Johnny Carson made jokes about everyone: politicians, musicians, actors. But Wayne Newton took those jokes personally, especially when they touched on his appearance or implied things about his private life. One afternoon, Newton stormed into NBC Burbank unannounced, marched straight into Carson's office and said, "You can make fun of my music, but if you ever joke about my sexuality again, I'll kick your ass." Carson stood up, calm, towering, stone cold, and said only, "Get out before I have you thrown out." The next morning, Newton's name was permanently blacklisted. Johnny Carson could handle insults, but physical threats? That was a line no one crossed. 3. Charles Grodin, the confrontational comic who pushed too far. Charles Grodin's shtick was brilliant. Dry, awkward, confrontational comedy that blurred the line between act and reality. Carson loved it at first. Grodin was unpredictable, sarcastic, and unlike any other guest. But over the years, Grodin escalated the tension. He accused Carson of not listening, mocked his interviewing skills, and implied on air that Carson didn't care about his guests. A deeply sore point for a man who struggled with emotional connection. One night in 1990, Grodin pushed too far. He performed a bit mocking Carson's tone, his detachment, even hinting that Carson was phoning it in. Johnny smiled, but the room went cold. After the segment, Carson quietly said 4 words to his producer. "We're done with that." Grodin was never booked again. 4. Shelley Winters, the infamous drink-throwing meltdown. Shelley Winters could be brilliant. She could also be unpredictable. And on the night that ended her Tonight Show career, she was both. Winters arrived tipsy, then drunk, then incoherent. Carson tried to steer the interview gently, but when he made a harmless joke, one Winters had laughed at in past appearances, she exploded. She grabbed her drink, a full whiskey, and threw the entire glass into Johnny Carson's face. The audience gasped. Carson froze. The cameras cut. Backstage, he was livid in a way almost no staff member had ever seen. Winters was escorted out and banned for life. 5. Rich Little, the imitator. Carson grew to hate. Rich Little was a Tonight Show favorite for years. His impressions were legendary, his appearances reliable, and Carson once adored having him on. Then, suddenly, he vanished from the show. There was no fight, no incident, no scandal. Carson simply grew tired of him. Little stayed on every moment, performing impressions nonstop backstage. It exhausted Carson. Worse, Carson realized Little was repeating material from previous appearances. To Johnny, that was creative laziness, a near-mortal sin. The booking team stopped calling. Little didn't even know he was banned until years later. 6. Truman Capote. The interview Carson cut short. By the mid-70s, Truman Capote's addictions were beginning to take a toll. When he appeared on The Tonight Show, he was visibly impaired, slurring, wandering, and slipping into inappropriate stories he couldn't finish. Carson did everything to save the interview, but ultimately cut it short after just 4 minutes. An extremely rare move. During the break, Johnny told Capote's team, "He's not coming back." Capote's ban was permanent and devastating. 7. The Smothers Brothers. The political ambush Johnny never forgave Carson kept politics at arm's length. Light jokes? Fine. Partisan speeches? Absolutely not. But the Smothers Brothers were activists first, comedians second. During one Tonight Show appearance, Tom Smothers launched into an anti-war monologue completely unscripted and not approved in pre-interview. Carson smiled politely, but his eyes went dead. Afterwards, he told producers, "Too much trouble for what we get." They weren't explicitly banned, but they entered what the staff called Carson Purgatory. Their invitations slowed, then stopped. 8. Morton Downey Jr., the Chaos Merchant. Carson despised Morton Downey Jr. Represented everything Carson hated about the direction talk shows were going: loud, angry, confrontational, political, sensational. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1988, Downey stormed the stage as if it were his own, shouted over Carson, criticized other hosts, and played to the audience with circus ringmaster energy. Carson's face never changed, but internally, the verdict was already written. After the show, Carson said simply, "That's not television. That's a circus act." Downey never returned. These 8 guests made the same fatal mistake. They forgot that Johnny Carson, the charming, soft-spoken, polite Midwesterner, was also the most quietly powerful man in Hollywood. Cross him, embarrass him, or betray him, and your career paid the price. Some recovered, some didn't, but every one of them learned the same lesson. On The Tonight Show, respect wasn't suggested, it was required. But the deeper truth behind these bans wasn't just ego, anger, or power. It was the complicated, guarded man behind the desk, the man viewers never truly saw. Carson wasn't petty. He was protective. Protective of the show he built, protective of the environment he demanded, protective of the legacy he fought to keep untarnished during a time when television was rapidly changing around him. To understand the weight of these bans, you have to understand the loneliness that shaped Johnny Carson. He was a man who controlled everything because control was the only thing that kept him steady. Fame made him cautious. Betrayal made him colder. And every guest who crossed those invisible lines reminded him of a world he spent his whole life trying to keep outside the walls of Studio 6B. People assumed his bans were overreactions, but to Carson, they were necessary corrections. A threat to the tone? Gone. A violation of trust? Gone. A performer who brought chaos instead of charm? Gone. Carson built The Tonight Show on smoothness, class, rhythm, and a very specific kind of humor that kept America comfortable. Anything that disrupted that delicate balance was treated like a crack in the foundation. And there was something else, something darker, that his closest staff whispered about. They said Carson could forgive mistakes, but never disrespect. That was his trigger. That was the invisible red line. Joan Rivers's betrayal felt like emotional abandonment. Wayne Newton's threat felt like an insult to his dignity. Shelley Winters's meltdown felt like humiliation. Rich Little's laziness felt like a personal slight. Grodin's confrontational act felt like mockery. Truman Capote's disastrous appearance felt like a stain on the show's integrity. The Smothers Brothers' ambush felt like manipulation. Morton Downey Jr. felt like the future Carson feared. Loud, messy, tasteless. Each ban was less about the moment and more about what that moment represented. A violation of the order he demanded in a world where very few things were within his control. And that's the irony of Johnny Carson. The man who made millions laugh every night was also a man quietly fighting to keep his kingdom from slipping through his fingers, holding on with a polite smile and the quiet power to erase anyone who broke the rules of his carefully crafted world.